Montana Territory, 1884. The wind howled over the high plains, rattling the wooden sign above the general store in Dry Creek, just as loud as the voice of Magnolia Grace Garrison echoing through its open door. You think I will not say it just because you are the sheriff's wife. You have a weasel of a husband, Miriam, and I would tell him to his face if he ever bothered to show it around here. Chairs scraped against floorboards. Two old men outside the saloon stopped their game of checkers. A dog barked once and then seemed to think better of it. Inside the store, Miriam Stone turned red as a barn and stormed out, her heels clacking against the wood. Magnolia stood there, arms folded, chin high, her long dark braid falling over one shoulder. "Lord help me," muttered the shopkeeper, "you just keep digging that grave, Maggie." But Magnolia only shrugged and turned back to the shelf of flour sacks. "I say what needs saying, none of the rest of you will." Her cousins whispered behind her back, her aunt called her difficult. Her own mother had once said, "You talk like you are trying to chase every man from here to butt clean off the earth." And she had, most of them, not that she cared. Magnolia had no patience for men who wanted a woman to be soft-spoken and agreeable, not when her life had been built on grit and fire. Her father had died in a cattle stampede when she was 12. Since then, she had worked beside her brothers breaking horses, mended fences, and planted seeds in cracked earth. She had done everything a man could do and then some. But still, they said she was too mouthy to marry. That afternoon, as she stepped out into the dirt street with her bag of flour, a rider was just tying off his horse outside the blacksmith's. He was tall, lean, with sun-browned skin and a hat pulled low over dark, wind-blown hair. He led a black gelding with a limp and spoke quietly to the blacksmith as he handed over the reins. Magnolia paused, eyes narrowing. She had never seen him before. "Who is that?" she asked the shopkeeper who had come to lean in the doorway. "Name's Boone Vexley. Drove up from Wyoming with a trail herd last week. They say he is staying through winter." She watched him a moment longer. There was a calmness to him, like a still lake before a storm, and something in the way he moved made her heart tick strangely in her chest. Boone turned then, eyes catching hers. For a second he just looked, not like he was measuring her or dismissing her, just seeing her. She looked away first. That night Magnolia found him again, or maybe he found her. She was helping her youngest cousin load firewood outside the church when a voice spoke from the shadows. "Do you always speak like that?" She spun around, startled. Boone leaned against the fence, arms crossed. "Like what?" she asked stiffly. "Like you are daring the whole damn town to argue with you." She straightened. "Someone has to. They would all rather whisper and lie. I do not have time for that." He nodded slowly. "Good, that is the voice I have been waiting for." Magnolia blinked. "What?" He pushed off the fence and walked closer. "You speak truth, even if it cuts. That is rare. I have spent years listening to folks say what they think someone wants to hear. Gets real hollow after a while." "Well," she said, heart beating faster than she wanted it to, "you will not get hollow with me. I am counting on it." He tipped his hat and walked away. The next few days, Magnolia found herself seeing more of Boone. He helped the blacksmith during the day, but in the evenings he came by her family's land, offering to help with fence repair or to lead the mule team while they cleared a patch for spring planting. He never talked too much. Just listened, steady and unbothered as she railed about the town's nonsense or her cousin's laziness or the way the preacher kept asking when she would settle down and be sweet. When she asked why he kept showing up, he said simply, "You work like someone who does not expect anyone else to." "I respect that." One morning she found him at the edge of their field staring toward the mountains. "You thinking of heading back to Wyoming?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, that place has too many ghosts." She said nothing. She had her own. They stood in silence a long while, the kind that was not heavy but waiting. Boone finally turned to her. "My wife died 5 winters ago. Fever took her and our boy, buried them outside Laramie." Magnolia's throat tightened. "I have not stayed anywhere since," he said. Until now. He looked at her then not with pity or need but with something like recognition. That night, Magnolia's mother cornered her in the kitchen. "You are spending too much time with that drifter. Folks are talking." "Let them," Magnolia said, washing her hands in the basin. "He is a cowboy with no roots. And I am a woman with too much voice," she said, drying her hands and turning. "Maybe we suit each other." The next day, Boone came by with a box he'd built himself. Inside were tools, a new hammer, a whetstone, and a fine-handled knife. "For you," he said. Magnolia stared at the box. "Why?" "Because I want to build something here with someone strong enough to hold it up. You are that someone, Maggie." She swallowed hard. Her name sounded different from his mouth. "I have never belonged anywhere," he said, voice rough. "But I would like to belong with you." Her hands curled around the edge of the box. "Then stay," she whispered. He stepped closer, touched her cheek with a calloused hand. "I am not afraid of your voice," he said. "I rode all this way hoping to find someone who would not be quiet when the world needed loud." She leaned in, forehead resting against his. "Then you found her." And when he kissed her, it was not rushed or soft, it was honest, like everything else between them. That night she told her mother she was marrying Boone Vexley. Her mother just sighed. "Well, God help the both of you." Magnolia only smiled. "We do not need help, we have each other." And for the first time in her life she felt seen, not in spite of her voice but because of it. Because the cowboy had heard her, and had stayed. By late November, the frost came early and hard, and the wind carried a sharpness that stung exposed skin. Boone spent his mornings chopping firewood behind the garrison barn, the steady rhythm of axe striking pine echoing across the frozen pasture. Magnolia had taken to bringing him coffee in an old tin cup, her fingers red from the cold, her boots caked with frost-bitten mud. "You could have left with the trail herd," she said one morning, offering the cup without ceremony. "Most men would have." Boone looked up from the split log, breath clouding the air between them. "I've had enough of leaving." Magnolia didn't answer right away. She watched a hawk circle above the far ridge, its wings slicing through pale sky. "My brothers think I've lost my mind," she said finally. "Said you've got the look of a man with a past he won't name." Boone took the coffee, warmed his hands around it. "They're right, and yet you're still here." "I never said the past disqualified me from trying again." He sipped, eyes not leaving hers. "Didn't figure you were the kind of woman who needed a spotless man anyway." She laughed low, unexpected. "You figured right." That afternoon, he helped her fix the south gate where the post had rotted out. They worked without much talk, passing tools back and forth between them. When their hands brushed, neither of them pulled away. As the sun dipped low, painting the snow-dusted fields in gold, Magnolia stepped back and wiped her brow with her sleeve. "I've never had help with that gate," she said. "Tried fixing it 3 times last year. Gave up come spring." Boone adjusted the hinge and leaned his weight against the new post. "Sometimes it takes more than one set of hands." She watched him in silence, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding everything land, livestock, family expectations until someone stepped beside her and didn't try to take it away, only lift it with her. That night, Boone stayed for supper. Her father's old chair had sat empty for 6 years, and without asking, he took the stool by the stove instead. Magnolia noticed. So did her mother, though she didn't say anything until the dishes were cleared and the kitchen had quieted. "You going to keep feeding that man through winter?" Her mother asked without looking up from the churning butter. "If he keeps splitting wood and mending fences," Magnolia said, setting the kettle back on the iron grate, "maybe through spring." Her mother paused, hands slick with cream. "He doesn't flinch, not even when your uncle tried to bait him about Wyoming." "He's not afraid of truth," Magnolia said. "Or of me." Her mother turned, leaned her hip against the counter. "That's rare, I know." The next Sunday, Boone walked with her to church. No one said anything outright, but heads turned. The preacher hesitated when he saw them enter together, then continued his sermon without mention. Boone sat still beside her, hat in his lap, his eyes steady on the pulpit. Afterward, as they walked the dirt path back toward the Garrison homestead, Boone spoke first. "Your town's full of people who pretend not to see what's right in front of them." Magnolia tucked her hands into her coat. "They've always preferred silence." "I didn't come here to be quiet," she glanced sideways. "Then stay loud." The trail grew narrow where it cut through the aspens. When her skirt caught on a low branch, Boone reached to unhook it, his fingers brushing her calf. She didn't move away. "Been thinking about building a cabin," he said as they walked on, "back along the ridge where the pine grows thick." She stopped mid-step, heart thudding. "That's Garrison land. I'd ask permission," he said, stopping too, "but I'd rather ask you." She turned to face him fully. "Why there? It's close to you." Her breath made small white clouds in the cold. "And if I say yes? Then I'll build it as strong as I can. Door wide enough for your voice, roof tight enough to keep you warm." Her voice was quiet now, but sure. "I don't want a man who needs me small." "You'd never be that," he said. "Not with me." And just there, with the bare trees around them and the sound of creek ice cracking somewhere nearby, she reached for him. Her hand found his calloused and cold and held on. He squeezed it once, steady. Neither of them said what it meant. They didn't need to. By early December, the ground had frozen solid beneath the hooves of Boone's gelding, and smoke curled steady from the stovepipe of the Garrison house most hours of the day. The rhythm of the land slowed. Livestock fed from hay racks, wagons stayed in sheds, and folks kept indoors longer, talking less, watching more. Magnolia, though, rarely stayed still long enough to gather dust. She'd begun sketching Boone's cabin plans in the worn journal she'd once used to track planting rows. Her pencil strokes were sharp, focused. She didn't tell anyone about the pages, not even Boone. But after supper one evening, she left the book open on the table, pages weighted with a flat stone, and watched from the doorway as Boone's eyes fell on it. "You want the windows to face west?" he asked, running a hand over the page like it might tell him more. "I want the sun to find us in the evening," she said. "We'll work by light all day, best let the dark come slow." Boone nodded once, then flipped to the next page where she'd drawn a rough outline of shelving on the cabin's back wall. "Room enough for every tool I own," he said. "And every word I've ever written." He looked up. "You write?" "I don't shout for the sake of it," she said. "I write when I want the silence to say something too." Boone leaned back, studying her with something that felt heavier than admiration, something rooted and quiet, like he was still catching up to who she was. "I'd like to read it," he said. "Then you'd better build fast," she replied. Before the first snowfall deepened, Boone took a day to ride out with her brother Abram to haul timber from the ridge. Boone returned with a split knuckle and a quiet respect in Abram's eyes that hadn't been there before. When Magnolia asked what had changed, Abram only said, "He listens when you speak, even when you're not talking." The next week, Boone began laying the cabin's foundation. No one offered help, not because they didn't approve, but because they knew he wouldn't ask for it. Magnolia watched from the hill above with her arms folded tight against the cold, saying nothing, but leaving a wool scarf on the fence post each morning. One morning, as she crested the ridge with a pail of biscuits wrapped in linen, she found Boone not working but kneeling beside the cabin's growing wall, in his hand a small square of cloth. She approached slowly. "What is that?" Boone didn't flinch. "Belonged to my boy. I always bury something of his beneath the places I call home." She lowered herself beside him, knees crunching the frozen grass. "You've done this before." "Twice," he said. "Neither place held." She reached over and laid her hand gently atop his. "This one will." He buried the cloth beneath the hearthstone. Neither of them spoke again until the wind shifted and the scent of pine filled the stillness between them. Later that day, Magnolia caught her cousin Ruth watching her from the barn loft. Ruth had always been more cautious, more apt to keep her thoughts folded tight like laundry on a shelf. But now she climbed down, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped into the yard. "You love him," Ruth said, not as accusation, but as certainty. Magnolia didn't answer right away. Then I didn't expect to. Ma says a woman ought to hold her tongue if she hopes to keep a man. Then she's never met one worth keeping. Ruth's eyes softened. He's building more than a house, you know, I know. That night Boone didn't come to the garrison table. Instead, he waited outside, his coat dusted with snowflakes, his breath thick in the cold air. Magnolia stepped out with his supper in a tin plate, but he didn't take it. I've been thinking, he said, about what it means to stay. She held the plate tighter. If you're about to change your mind, make it fast. He took her hand, fingers rough and chapped from hammer and frost. Maggie, I've slept under stars more nights than roofs. I've outrun storms, men, and memory, but I don't want to outrun you. I don't need saving, Boone. I know. But I do. His voice was low, not broken, but worn from years of carrying things alone. She looked at him, then really looked. Saw the man who had buried something sacred beneath their hearth. Saw the man who never once tried to quiet her. Then stay, she said. And we'll both learn the rest together. He took the plate and her hand, and they stood in the snow as the wind swept over them, two people not promising forever, but beginning it all the same. By mid-December, the cold had sunk deep into the bones of the land, and Boone's cabin stood with its frame sealed and roof shingled, smoke rising from the stovepipe in thin spirals. He'd moved in only 3 days earlier, and already the place smelled of pine pitch, ash, and leather. Magnolia stood in the doorway now, arms full of linens she'd stitched herself, her boots leaving clear impressions in the snow-dusted path. Boone stepped aside without a word, dusting sawdust from his palms. She moved past him and set the folded cloth on the bench he'd built beside the window. You've got space now, she said, brushing a loose thread from the top sheet. But it's hollow until there's life in it. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. I was hoping you'd say that. She didn't look at him. I'm not moving in until I'm your wife, Boone nodded slowly. I'd never ask you to. She turned to face him then, the light from the stove catching in her dark braid. I don't want a church full of people who don't understand me watching me vow what I already know, she said. But I want it said and I want it known. Boone stepped forward and took her hand. We'll speak it where it matters. I already cut the elm for a table. We'll use it as our altar if that suits you. She held his gaze, steady and sure. It does. He gave a small nod, then glanced toward the back wall. I finished the shelf, thought it might hold your pages. I brought some, she said, pulling a flat bundle wrapped in oilcloth from beneath her coat. They're not polished, but they're mine. He took it without opening it. That's all I ever wanted. Outside, the wind pushed low across the ridge and crows lifted from the bare cottonwoods. Magnolia followed Boone to the hearth, where he unwrapped the bundle and placed it on the shelf without ceremony, but with a kind of reverence that made her chest ache. You've lived quiet a long time, she said, her voice softened by the warmth of the fire. Even when you speak, there's a silence in you. I didn't know how to carry the ones I lost. So I let the silence do it. She sat on the edge of the table he'd built, her fingers brushing the edge where the grain curled like river current. I talk so loud sometimes I forget to leave room for what hurts. Boone crouched to feed another log into the stove, the light catching the side of his jaw. Maybe your voice and my quiet meet somewhere in the middle. When he stood again, he reached into his coat and drew out a small tin box. He opened it and held it toward her. Inside, nestled in cotton, sat a simple gold band. It was my mother's, he said. My father carved it himself. She wore it through every move, every hard year, said it reminded her she was chosen. Magnolia stared at it, her throat tightening. It's not fancy, Boone said, but it's earned. I don't want fancy, she whispered. I want honest. He took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had waited for her, her lips parted, but no words came. Boone leaned close, breath warm against her cheek. We'll say our vows before the ridge. No preacher, just you, me, the cold, and the truth. She nodded once. Let it be so. 3 days later, they stood where the tree line gave way to open sky, the wind tugging at Magnolia's shawl and Boone's collar. Her mother had sewn a dark blue dress for the occasion, the same one her grandmother had worn to her own wedding, and her brother Abram stood witness, arms folded, eyes unreadable but proud. Boone took her hands, and his voice, quiet though it was, carried clear through the cold. "I will not ask you to be less, only to walk beside me as you are." Magnolia's voice didn't tremble. "I will not quiet myself for comfort, but I will listen when you speak. Even in stillness." They sealed their promise with a kiss beneath the naked aspens, the sky wide and pale above them, and the land below hard and waiting. That night, the fire in Boone's cabin burned brighter than any other in the valley. Magnolia stood in the center of the room, her boots by the door, her braid unbound. Boone crossed the floor to her, took her face in his hands, and for the first time neither of them had to speak. Because everything that needed saying had been said. And everything that came next they would build together. The cabin held heat well, even in the deep of winter. By late January, the walls no longer smelled of sawdust but of boiled coffee, lamp oil, and the faint lavender Magnolia kept tucked in a pouch inside her dresser drawer. Boone had carved her a writing desk beneath the west window, and in the low light of morning, she sat there with a wool shawl wrapped over her shoulders, pencils scratching across the paper like wind over snow. Boone came in from tending the traps he'd set along the lower creek, boots leaving slush across the entry rug she'd woven from old grain sacks. He unlaced them carefully, glancing at her without interrupting. She didn't look up. "Did you catch anything?" "2 rabbits. 1 full-grown, 1 young." "I let the little one go." She nodded once, turning the page. "Smart." He hung his coat, then stepped to the stove, stirring the contents of the pot that had simmered since dawn. It was a habit now, him bringing in whatever the land gave and her turning it into something warming and worth eating. Neither of them had spoken of roles, but somehow each day had unfolded with rhythm and purpose. Boone set the ladle aside. "The ridge trail's blown over. I'll need to shovel it before Abram brings the wagon up next week. I can help. I know." She set her pencil down and finally looked at him. "You still think about Wyoming?" "No," he said, pulling a chair close to the stove. "But I still carry it." She let that sit between them for a moment, the fire popping softly in the stove. Then she stood, crossed to the cupboard, and pulled down the cloth bundle she'd sewn shut the week after their vows. Inside were the pages she hadn't shown him yet, stories that reached deeper than the ones he'd placed on the shelf. She set them in his lap without explanation. He looked up at her. "They're about women who stayed, even when the world kept asking them to go." He opened the top page, reading silently. She watched as his brow furrowed, his thumb brushing along the edge of the paper like he was memorizing it. "These are hard," he said after a while, "and beautiful. You think they're too much. I think they're true," she breathed in slow. "Then they're yours to keep." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. Boone reached across the space between them and took her hand. "You ever think about teaching?" he asked. She frowned. "Teaching what? Writing, truth, voice. There's girls in Dry Creek who have never once been asked what they think. That town barely tolerates me now. Then we don't ask their permission, we offer something better. You've lived bold. That kind of living teaches on its own." He wasn't smiling, but his voice was sure. Magnolia sat beside him, her hand still in his. "All right," she said, "but only if you build a second desk." He nodded once. "I will." That spring, Boone cleared a patch of earth behind the cabin, planting rows of beans, squash, and tobacco. Magnolia began hosting small gatherings under the elm tree, reading aloud to whoever came. At first, it was only Ruth and Abram's youngest girl, but by June, 6 girls sat cross-legged in the grass, listening with wide eyes as Magnolia read from her pages. Boone worked quietly nearby, splitting kindling or sanding the shelves inside the new shed he'd raised with Abram. He never interrupted, but he always listened. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the ridge and the girls had gone home, Boone walked up to where Magnolia was folding the blanket she'd laid out beneath the tree. You make them feel like they matter, he said. They do. He took the corner of the blanket from her hands and helped fold it. You ever think about starting something permanent, a school maybe? She looked toward the slope where the wildflowers had begun to bloom. If we do, she said, it'll be different. No rote, no silence for the sake of manners. They'll write their minds. Boone nodded. Then let's build it. They did. By midsummer, with help from Abram and Ruth's husband, they raised a one-room schoolhouse beside the cabin. Boone carved a sign for the door, simple and clean, the Ridge School. Magnolia taught 3 days a week. The girls came on foot, some from as far as 2 miles. A few boys joined by Autumn, drawn more by curiosity than intent, but they came. She didn't turn them away. The first snowfall came early again that year, but the schoolhouse held heat from the iron stove and the steady presence of Boone, who repaired the roof after every storm and kept the path clear each morning before sunrise. One night, as the wind howled outside and the fire cast long shadows on the walls, Magnolia lay beside Boone beneath the heavy quilt she'd stitched from old cotton dresses and feed sacks. His arm rested around her waist, calloused fingers brushing the hollow of her hip. "I never thought peace would look like this," she said quietly. He didn't speak right away, just pressed his lips to her temple. "It's not peace unless it's earned." She turned toward him, her hand resting over his heart. "Then we've earned it." The lamp burned low, throwing golden light across the floorboards Boone had sanded smooth. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in the trees an owl called once, then fell silent. Inside the cabin, there was nothing unfinished. They had built their life not from ease, but from the steadiness of showing up day after day, word after word, hand to hand. And they kept showing up for every morning after.